Hello, my name is Neil Kitching. I'm the author of a book called Carbon Choices on the Common Sense Solutions to Our Climate and Nature Crisis. This is a picture of me at Dunblane, my hometown in Scotland. I'm a geographer and ex-accountant. I then moved into sustainable development policy work, and I work as an energy and water specialist for Scottish Enterprise. Today I will give you a whistle-stop tour of climate change. In section 1, I will help you to understand carbon dioxide and its effects on the planet. In section 2, I will introduce the 10 building blocks that I believe society needs to put in place before we can tackle climate change. In section 3, I will apply these building blocks to our everyday lives, our homes, electricity, our diets and leisure activities. In section 4, I will consider the role of business, carbon offsetting, rewilding, and look forward to the climate change conference in November. I will close with some discussion topics that you may wish to discuss with your students. But first, some background to me. I was brought up in Perth on the edge of the Highlands. I then moved to Edinburgh to study geography. I then moved south to London and then to Sheffield, where I trained and qualified as a chartered accountant. I worked in Sheffield for a number of years and then in Stirling, and then I had a midlife career change from accountancy to sustainable development policy officer, and now work as an energy and water specialist with Scottish Enterprise. And just to prove I lived and worked in Sheffield, here's me at a very busy day at the office working with KPMG. And at the bottom right there, you can see I'm being interviewed by Radio Hallam as part of a charity fundraising event. Humans emit over 40 billion tonnes of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere each year. 1 tonne of carbon dioxide would fill a hot air balloon. I use the analogy of a bathtub. You can see if the bath is fairly full, then any extra water flowing in causes a great risk of flooding and other disasters. During the COVID crisis, carbon emissions fell by around 8 to 10%. But that's not really a fall. It just means the rate of flow into the bathtub was reduced by 10%. The level of the water is still rising. So what we need to reach net zero is for the tap to be turned off or turned down to a trickle, and for that to be more than offset by the amount of water evaporating or flowing out through the plug hole. On average, we emit around 12 tonnes of carbon dioxide equivalent per year. You can see from the graph that there's some obvious areas like home energy, surface travel, and flights that we can all accept and understand. But there's a huge impact of what we consume and what we import from overseas. So food and drink is a bigger impact than our home energy and travel. And buying stuff, much of which is imported from China and developing countries, is the biggest impact of all. It's this consumption of goods and services that we don't always take account of when we're thinking about our total carbon emissions. Our total human impact on the climate can be described by this formula. As you all know, population has grown enormously in the last 100 years, but at least the rate of growth is declining. It takes decades for changes in policy to work through and reduce our total population. Consumption has also grown enormously in some parts of the world. The average Briton emits over 100 times that of an average Malawian. Or put another way, the 10% wealthy elite emit over 50% of global carbon emissions. This is a problem we could tackle more quickly than cutting population growth. Carbon intensity, or resource efficiency, is improving slowly and steadily. It really has offset the growth in population, but it can't offset the enormous growth in consumption as well. The amount of land used to grow food and to produce resources such as timber and quarried materials is still increasing, and this is reducing the space for wildlife. My conclusion is we need to tackle all 4 of these issues, but to me our wasteful consumption is the biggest issue and the one that's least talked about. The biggest and most obvious emitter of carbon dioxide is our burning of fossil fuels. Coal is the worst culprit and is used primarily in order to create electricity. Oil is used primarily in the transport sector, but also to make plastics, which are essential for our economy. And gas is used by industry and for heating and also to create electricity. Around 1/4 of all our emissions come from agriculture. Some of this is carbon dioxide from farm machinery, but more is from nitrous oxide and methane. Nitrous oxide comes from the application of manure and the management of manure, and also from nitrogen-based fertilizers. Most methane comes from sheep and cattle. They are ruminants, and methane is emitted as part of the natural digestion process of these animals. On top of that, you get methane from rice paddy fields, especially if these fields are flooded, which allows vegetation to rot and give off methane. When thinking about our impact on climate change, people tend to think about their use of electricity, how they heat their homes, their travel, and their flights. But the four big things that haven't really been mentioned, the four elephants in the room, are number one, consumerism, and in particular fast fashion, which accounts for about 10% of carbon emissions, more than that of international shipping and aviation combined. Secondly, refrigeration. It's a double whammy. There's energy used to keep things cool. There's also refrigerant gases used in fridges and in air conditioning. Thirdly, there's entire meat and dairy products industry. The methane emissions from that are enormous. And fourthly, there's cement and concrete, another very carbon intensive process. Manufacturing cement is again another double whammy, with carbon emitted during the process of transforming limestone to cement, and also the massive amounts of energy required to heat it. In my view, the loss of nature is as big a concern as climate change. Of course, the two overlap. For example, cutting down trees releases carbon dioxide. The biggest impact is agriculture and industrial fishing, which have transformed much of our planet. In many countries, forests have been decimated. This, of course, applies to the United Kingdom and Scotland, my home country. In much of the Highlands, grazing by sheep and deer prevent natural regeneration. Then there are invasive species invading our land, seas, air, and soil. By definition, they tend to outcompete native species. The picture at the bottom left is giant hogweed, which spreads easily and causes burning to your skin if you touch them, most often affecting children out playing. Even worse, our nature reserves and many of our national parks have become islands of protected nature surrounded by areas of intensive agriculture. Under current climate, it is difficult for the genetic pool to spread, but in future these islands of wildlife will be stuck in the wrong climatic zones. It is that serious. Climate change will devastate nature and our lives as we depend, of course, on nature. Nature loss and land use change are intertwined. Humans have altered over half of the world's land surface. Much of the rest is ice, mountains, remote forests or deserts. This really doesn't leave much space for nature and wildlife. Intensive agriculture and grazing are the main culprits. The picture at the top right is in India, where a dam and irrigation scheme have removed all the water from the river. Not good for the fish or the people that live downstream. Bottom right is a picture from the Scottish Highlands, showing that the simple act of fencing out grazing animals can quickly lead to regeneration of the forest. Our climate is very sensitive. During the last ice age, only 12,000 years ago, Scotland was buried under 1,000 metres of ice, an ice sheet very similar to that covering Greenland today. The pictures at the top are from Greenland, the pictures at the bottom are from Scotland. We came out of the ice age all due to very minor changes in the Earth's orbit around the Sun, amplified by natural feedback effects. Imagine what will happen in the future from human interference. Today the temperature is around 5 degrees warmer than in the height of the last ice age. The current predictions are for the temperature to rise by a further 3 degrees by 2100. Scientists are agreed that on balance the planet will warm, but there is still some uncertainty around the detail. Contrails from aviation can spread out and create clouds, and these can heat the planet at night, but possibly cool the planet by reflecting the sun's rays during the day. So clouds are complicated. They contain water vapor, which is a powerful greenhouse gas, and they reflect radiation. And there's a concern that climate change may shift the pattern of cloud cover across the globe. Another huge concern is the ocean currents. If these shift, that could cause catastrophic regional climate change and potentially global climate change. And of course, there's a concern around the Gulf Stream, which keeps the northwest of Europe rather mild. And then there's the danger of tipping points, where small changes can ripple out and cause a much bigger impact. These could be caused by drought or forest fires, or the melting of the permafrost, all of which will release more carbon dioxide, and in the case of permafrost, even more worryingly, release methane into the atmosphere. And it's possible that these could create permanent changes. For example, the Amazon rainforest could turn to savanna. The impacts of climate change are scary, to say the least. Many of these effects will be felt through the medium of water, whether that is drought, flood, or sea level rise. The picture at the top left is from Namibia, already a dry region. It is difficult to comprehend the impacts of climate change if this makes this region hotter and drier. Closer to home, bottom left, is my local park, where flash floods have eroded away a popular footpath. And the picture at the bottom right is the main road in Argyll, which is now repeatedly closed by landslips. On an international level, climatic zones will shift, causing hardship and mass migration. One can only imagine the political fallout that will arise from all of this. To tackle climate change, there are three ways of approaching it. Firstly is a top-down, rather formal process through governments cooperating through the United Nations. Secondly, businesses can tackle climate change. They can be pushed by investors and shareholders, and that can have a knock-on influence on their supply chain and on consumers. And thirdly, there's communities and consumers making their own choices, who we vote for, what we invest in, what we buy, and how we influence one another. In reality, we need all three to be working together. This slide is saying a very similar thing, but in a different way. We need everyone to work together. All levels of government need to work with businesses, communities, and individuals. The government's role is to set regulations, subsidies, and taxes to influence businesses and individuals. Businesses need to work with the government to produce sensible regulations, then to act on these regulations to develop and sell products and services that are better for the planet. Individuals need to choose to buy these products. Individuals can also campaign to governments and businesses for tighter and for better regulations. Moving on to section 2. Here I identify the 10 building blocks in my book that are the foundations for a low-carbon economy. At present, it is very hard for an individual or a business to make a difference without having all of these in place. I won't read all 10 out just now. I have a slide on each soon to follow. But think of how society tackled smoking. The government introduced taxes which rose every year. They introduced marketing bans, restrictions on supply. Cigarettes are only sold behind the counter. Also restrictions on demand. Firstly, a ban on children smoking, and then introducing a smoking ban in pubs. This was backed up with major educational campaigns and subsidised programmes to wean people off smoking. This has all been tackled over decades using a wide range of initiatives. The result is a shift in peer pressure from encouraging smoking to, in most places, discouraging smoking. We need to think in the same way about tackling our addiction to burning fossil fuels. Thinking long term is the first of my 10 building blocks. It is perhaps one of the most difficult to tackle. We are governed by politicians who think on a 5-year cycle, who have no vested interest in thinking beyond their period of office. And businesses are notorious at making short-term decisions to satisfy their shareholders. There are rare exceptions. The two products at the foot of this slide both come with a lifetime guarantee. Think of the impact of this. The retailer has to trust that the manufacturer has produced a quality and long-lasting product. The manufacturer has to think about the product design and ensure quality in the manufacturing process. The consumer must be willing to pay a bit more initially, but everyone benefits in the long run. The environment benefits too, from less resources being required and less waste going to landfill. Of course, it is difficult to force people to think long term. All I can say is think of your grandchildren. Will you be able to justify your current lifestyle to them? Think about it. Economics affects all our lives. The government has a huge role in setting taxes and subsidies. A small charge, only 5p per plastic bag, led to a 90% reduction in our use of single-use plastic bags. In a similar way, the sugar tax in fizzy drinks has had a beneficial impact on our health. Manufacturers reformulated their recipes, resulting in few of us actually paying the tax, but the health benefits were achieved. Sensible taxes can and should benefit society. But some items are just too cheap. This is a photograph of a skip in our street. The builders had excess bricks and simply threw them out, destined to go straight to landfill. What a waste of valuable resources. So we need to use taxes and subsidies to influence our behaviour. In my view, we should shift our taxes away from income tax towards taxes on resources, that's resource extraction, and also on our expenditure on high carbon products. I believe that we need much stronger and sensible regulations in order to solve our climate crisis. Often regulations are opposed by consumers and by newspapers who run campaigns against them. But if you think back to the seatbelt laws, to catalytic converters, to smoking bans, once these are in place, the public readily accept these regulations. So we need sensible regulations. The example on the left, to me, isn't sensible regulations. This is a notice in my local park, and I don't believe anybody probably reads this. But on the right is the energy efficiency labels now attached to all major electrical appliances that we buy across the EU. Originally, they were installed with an A to an F rating, with A being the most energy efficient. Very quickly, all the manufacturers managed to produce and sell A-rated products. So the regulations were reviewed and tightened. So there's now 3 upper levels of A+, A++, and A+++. So this is a good example of regulations that work, but they need to be kept under constant review to ensure that they're achieving their objectives. We need and should demand better product design. The picture at the top right is in a skip and just shows the result of poor product design where electronic goods are thrown out after 2 or 3 years. We should be applying the circular economy principles of designing out waste, keeping products in longer use and regenerating natural systems. The picture at the bottom right is a pen that I was given at an event. Once it was broken, I took it apart and you can see all the different parts and components. There's no way that any of these will ever be recycled. So we have a product here that is destined for landfill. We need stronger regulations to influence the design of products and to increase recycling, reuse and repair of goods and products. Innovation can improve our lives, increase efficiency and reduce costs. And innovation can happen much faster than anybody predicts. The price of solar panels, offshore wind and battery storage has tumbled in recent years, enabling enormous change much faster than anybody predicted. If you look at the telephone box, nobody predicted that these would become redundant so quickly. The LEDs have changed from a traditional 60-watt bulb to a compact fluorescent 15-watt bulb to an LED 5-watt bulb. That's 10 to 12 times better in a matter of about 1 decade. And I think one area that's going to change enormously is agriculture. The picture at the bottom is indoor or vertical farming using LEDs. It requires no pesticides, no wasted water, and very little fertilizer. To live in a low-carbon economy, we need a lot of targeted investment. Stirling Council have installed 19,000 solar panels on 4,000 council houses. We need a massive rollout of electric vehicle charging points. We need to change all our street lamps to LEDs. We need more cycle paths, more investment in public transport. And we also need to invest to protect against the impacts of climate change, in particular flood defences. The good thing about all this is that many of these changes will improve our lives and should not be seen as a burden. Education, jobs and training are all critical building blocks. Children should be taught about nature and climate change from nursery through school to tertiary education. Adults will also need to be taught, as many of us don't learn about climate change at school. My son graduated recently after studying philosophy and politics, yet in 4 years was not taught about the impacts of climate change. There has been and will be a massive shift in jobs. In the 1920s in the United Kingdom, 1.2 million people worked in the coal industry. Today it is down to a few hundred. In a similar way, the oil and gas industry will follow suit. So we need a programme to train and retrain so that people don't feel they have to fight against these changes. A low-carbon economy will need engineers, plumbers, mechanics, consultants, marketing people. In fact, nearly all jobs will be affected. It is an opportunity for young people in the future. In wealthy countries, many of us simply consume far too much. It's been estimated that if everybody in the world consumed the same as average Britain, we would require 3 planets in order to provide all the resources, and 5 planets if we all consumed the same as the average American. The picture at the bottom left shows the choice in my supermarket of margarines and butters. There's a great range of choices in terms of price and brands, but how can I tell which one is low carbon? There's nothing there to help me as a consumer to buy what is really going to be better for the planet. So in my view, we need carbon labels on common foods and on common products to help the public to make better choices. Communities also have a role. They can do things that governments and individuals can't do themselves. The top left is an example of community food growing in allotments. The bottom left is a work party cutting down rhododendrons, an invasive species that threatens local habitats. The top right is in the Okavanga Delta, where the local community own and operate the tourism, which provides them with a vested interest in tourism and to protect the habitat and wildlife. And the bottom right is a local shop in Dunblane called Way Ahead, where people can buy food products using reusable containers, avoiding and cutting out all plastic and waste. And finally, there's investing in resource efficiency, which allows us to do more with less resources and can lead to a higher quality of life. Resource efficiency can have a huge impact. So you can actually insulate homes to such a high standard that it barely requires any heating in order to keep warm even during the winter. But resource efficiency can only go so far. You always need a certain amount of energy in order to boil a kettle to 100 degrees centigrade for a cup of tea. So in section 3, I will apply these common sense principles to our everyday lives, thinking about our use of electricity, our buildings, our surface transport and also flying, our tourism and leisure activities, agriculture and our diets, and to our shopping and consumer behaviours. I start with electricity because I believe we are moving to a more electrified society. We're all going to be moving very quickly to using electric vehicles, and I believe that many of us will purchase heat pumps in order to heat our houses. So we need to phase out coal across the world and we can do that through taxes based on carbon emissions. We need to restrict the burning of gas or burn gas with carbon capture and storage. We need vastly more renewable energy, and we need innovation in demand management and energy and electricity storage. There's a lot of change coming. There's going to be a lot more flexibility in our home energy use. We may have electric vehicle charging at home. We may have heat pumps. We may have solar panels. We may have batteries. And we may have complex systems for managing the interaction between all of these. When thinking about our homes, the first consideration is where you choose to live. The picture in the top left is a so-called eco-house, but it's built in the countryside and the owners will be completely dependent on the use of a private car. So where you choose to live, what's the size of your house? How many people do you share that house with? We then need to think about how buildings are constructed. The use of wood locks away carbon for decades, in contrast to buildings made of concrete that require a lot of carbon dioxide in the production. We then need to think about how we heat our houses. And this could be done through district heat networks, that's hot water pipes running underground between houses, or through heat pumps attached to either individual houses or heat pumps for groups of houses. For transport, our top priority is not to rush to electric vehicles. Our top priority is to reduce the need to travel. Where do you choose to live? Can you walk to shops? Can your children walk or cycle to school? We need to design livable and walkable cities. We also need good public transport in cities, but recognising that this will always be difficult in rural areas. There is a strong argument to subsidise public transport and also to tax and regulate against petrol and diesel. Travel bans and polluting vehicles into city centres can be effective and encourage people and businesses to invest in cleaner alternatives. Should we continue to build new roads? Possibly not. All the evidence shows that they have the effect of increasing traffic. Of course, electric vehicles are the future for cars, vans and light vehicles. The picture at the bottom right is a new electric vehicle charging station in Stirling. Rows and rows of electric chargers at a park and ride scheme under a solar canopy. My concern is that running an electric vehicle avoids us paying petrol taxes. They will be very cheap to run per mile, near zero in the case of access to free electricity, and this will inevitably lead to more travel and congestion. As a society, we need to think how to address this issue. Road tolls or charging per mile may be unpopular, but may actually be necessary. Flying is a problem. The reason for that is that there's no technology that's ready to be deployed, and probably none in the next couple of decades that's going to substantially reduce or eliminate emissions. The only solution that I have is to tax our flights based on carbon dioxide emissions and to regulate aviation much more severely. We need to permanently remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. The same amount of carbon should be removed as is emitted. At the moment, that's been done by planting a few trees, but that is not a long-term solution. The only permanent solution is to bury carbon dioxide deep underground, and that is going to be expensive. The emissions from tourism and leisure around the world are growing fast. At least they were until COVID-19. Travel agents in the United Kingdom even offer day trips for families to Lapland. Think of the carbon emissions from that. Does your child really need this? My conclusion is it's not so much what activities you choose to do, it is where you choose to do it. Can you participate locally? Do you use public transport? Can you share transport? For example, walking football could be low or high carbon, depending where you do it and whether you feel the need to buy new clothing and equipment. Following a major football club may mean regular long-distance car journeys and also flights across Europe. Of course, some tourist attractions, such as the Eden Centre in Cornwall, are educational and fun. Here you can learn about biodiversity and the environment, ideal for school trips. I don't have many solutions to the carbon impacts of tourism, but my advice is to take more local holidays, and occasional long-distance holidays should be for a longer time period and be treated as special. I would also like to see tax incentives to encourage community involvement in tourism so that locals benefit from it. The carbon impact of food is complicated, but this is an area where we can easily make choices. The chart shows the disproportionate impact of beef and dairy products. Unfortunately, this also applies to cheese and chocolate too. An important geography message is that the lowest carbon footprint is crops grown in the regions that best suit that crop, at the right temperature, rainfall and soils. That way, no artificial heating or irrigation is required, and fewer fertilizers and pesticides are needed. Bananas grown in the tropics have a low carbon footprint. The transport element in the carbon footprint is less than you would imagine. Shipping does burn dirty diesel fuel, but the vast scale of container ships means that the carbon footprint per product is rather low. Studies have shown that it can be less intensive to import apples and lamb from Australia than to grow locally. However, you should avoid all foods that have been air freighted to the shops. So an important message is it's not where your food comes from, but how much you eat and waste and what you choose to eat. Fruit, vegetables and cereals are all low in terms of their carbon footprint, and peas can actually add nitrogen back into the soil, reducing the need for fertilizer and associated nitrous oxide emissions. Some more thoughts on our diets. Remember, our diets are between 1/4 to 1/3 of our carbon impact, and it's the easiest area to change quickly. Marks and Spencer's claim to be very green, yet here they are marketing beef, the highest carbon impact food. Beef from tropical forests cut down in Brazil is perhaps the worst case, but even UK beef has a high carbon footprint. Scottish oats have a very low impact. After looking at all the alternatives, I've started drinking oat milk, yet I can't find UK oat milk and buy a product that is made in Scandinavia. Although I have said that transport is not too important, there are other good reasons to buy locally. It is clearly better for the local farmers and economy. The foods are likely to be fresher and taste better. So to conclude, food should be grown in the best climate and soils for that crop. In general terms, a plant-based diet is better. Transport is not as important as you might think, except you must avoid asparagus flown in from overseas. Local foods are good for the economy, and we need much better education, dietary advice and carbon labels on products in supermarkets. People simply don't know the simple facts around food carbon footprints. Many of us consume too much. We are also overwhelmed with choice. As we grow wealthier, many find new ways to splash out on items which are arguably not essential. Fast cars, expensive whiskies. Many of these luxury items are relatively high carbon. Fast fashion creates more emissions than aviation. We need peer pressure to reverse. People should not feel pressurized to buy a new outfit for every night out. We need more regulation and directed taxes. The government could introduce regulations on manufacturers to provide lengthy product guarantees. This would increase the quality of products sold. The picture at the bottom left is a voluntary carbon label on a bag of cement. We need supermarkets to introduce labels to help us to make better choices. We need taxes to disincentivize the consumption of high-emission goods. A small tax on clothing could be reinvested in setting up proper recycling schemes. My message for the consumer is to buy quality and long-lasting goods, even if this costs more initially. And think before you buy. Do you need it? How long will you keep it for? How much energy will it use? How will you dispose of the product? If it is destined for landfill, then something is wrong. In section 4, I'm going to wrap up with a few thoughts on the role of business, carbon offsetting and rewilding. I will consider the role of COP26 and finish with some discussion topics that you may wish to raise with your students. Companies have an influence over half of our emissions, so it is important for every company to go green. The Grangemouth petrochemical plant is the biggest emitter in Scotland, but it employs many thousands of people. We need innovation and investment, perhaps a role for hydrogen to help these large industries to go green. The Scottish Whisky Association has set a net zero target for 2040. The whisky industry has agreed to collaborate, not to compete, on environmental issues, and this is good news. The picture at the bottom left is CMS Enviro in Cumbernauld. They install double and triple glazing in social houses. They reuse and recycle all the waste. They have energy efficient plant and premises. But most excitingly, they've invested in a demonstration centre for training their contractors and for showcasing their business to schools and colleges. All businesses need to set ambitious medium-term targets, but also to undertake immediate action. They should collaborate with their supply chain, with their community and customers. Business can be a force for good if directed properly and can deliver rapid change. But I believe we need more government regulations to force businesses in the right direction. Regulation needs to be flexible to allow businesses to decide how to deliver. Many businesses are setting targets to reduce their carbon emissions. Initially, most were a percentage reduction on their current impact to reduce the amount of harm. These were usually easy to achieve through energy efficiency, but could be wiped out by rapid increases in turnover. Other companies promised to be 100% renewable. For many companies, this just covers electricity, but it's much more meaningful if it can also cover heat and transport. More recently, many companies have set carbon neutral or net zero targets for their own operations. Companies such as BSkyB, Dell, Google, Nikkei, and Ørsted. Even BP has set a net zero target, although not until 2050. Unilever has set a net zero target for 2039, but it also includes its supply chain. BP has promised to cut the impact of the products it sells by 50% by 2050. Patagonia, Unilever, IKEA, and Natura have gone even further. Not to reduce the level of harm, but a positive story to restore nature and provide a positive contribution to society. To achieve these tough targets, businesses need a clear business strategy. They need to embed green thinking into the design of all their products and services, and will usually need to partner with their supply chains. Carbon offsetting is a controversial area. Some companies pay to prevent deforestation. That may have biodiversity benefits, but will do nothing to reduce global carbon emissions. Alternatively, you can pay to draw down carbon into plants, trees, or soils. This can remove carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and may have other benefits. Planting mangroves, seagrass, or kelp will draw down carbon dioxide, provide a nursery for young fish, and protect coastlines from storm damage. But such schemes may not be permanent. What if the trees you plant burn down in 20 years' time or die due to disease? You can pay to install renewable energy, which will reduce the rate of emissions, but only if it is replacing existing fossil fuels. Investing in energy efficiency may be better as that reduces the amount of carbon dioxide being emitted. However, all these schemes are limited and have issues around measurement. The only real solution at scale is to permanently bury carbon dioxide deep underground, locking it away back into the rocks. This will be expensive. To conclude, don't get me wrong, planting trees is a good thing to do and may benefit communities and nature. It can restore what we've already destroyed. But there is not enough land available to offset all of our emissions from fossil fuels. Despite my concerns about offsetting, I'm a strong advocate of rewilding nature, and perhaps this can be paid for by companies aiming to achieve net zero. Rewilding can be done at different scales: vast rural areas, pockets of land within agriculture, ribbons along our rivers, and even within towns and cities. It applies equally to our land and to our seas. Trees are returning to the lower slopes of the Cairngorms. In some places, fences are needed to deter grazing by sheep and deer. The trees don't always need to be planted, their seeds are already in the soil. More active rewilding in Scotland includes the reintroduction of red kites and beavers. Both have quickly become a source of interest for locals and tourists. Beavers, of course, cut down trees, create dams, and create more wetlands. This is good for fish and fishermen, although clearly not popular with all farmers. Perhaps a topic for discussion with your pupils. And so to COP26, perhaps the last chance for the world to come up with a strong climate agreement to prevent catastrophic climate change. It's called COP26 because it's the 26th series of United Nations negotiations on this topic. During those previous 25 negotiations, carbon emissions have continued to increase. The last major agreement was in Paris 5 years ago, introducing the concept of nationally determined contributions, where each country will voluntarily determine how much to reduce their emissions. So at Glasgow, we need to tighten these NDCs. We need a strong rule book around them. We need to agree finance, particularly how we help developing countries. And we need to agree on how or whether countries can offset to reduce the requirement to cut their emissions. And for non-government organisations, businesses and other organisations, they can join the Race to Zero, a commitment to at least reduce your carbon emissions by 50% by 2030. There's more information on this on my blog if you follow the link below. In my book, I come up with 5 common sense solutions. My simple question is whether your students agree that these common sense solutions will work. Firstly, reduce our need to travel and to electrify remaining travel. Secondly, to invest in innovative solutions to increase the efficiency of industry, decarbonise electricity and heat production. Thirdly, to consume fewer manufactured goods and for businesses to adopt circular economy approaches. Fourthly, to stop deforestation, restore degraded land and wildlife. And fifthly, to shift to a predominantly plant-based diet. This is a list of other discussion topics you might want to raise with your students. And for each of these, there are no right or wrong answers. The important issue is for the students to consider and think through the issues. Is population growth or consumption the main problem? Why is climate change difficult for society to solve? In what ways are nature and climate change connected? What ways can we discourage eating too much meat? How should we tackle the emissions from flying? How can we make every home energy efficient? How much of the UK should we set aside for nature to flourish? What do you hope for from the COP26 Climate Summit? So thank you for taking the time to listen to me today. I hope you've enjoyed it and learnt something out of it. My book, of course, is available on Amazon and Kindle, or you can email me for a signed copy. And if you want further information, please go to my website. It is www.carbonchoices.uk. Thank you.